Good evening, afternoon, or whatever time of the day it is in your part of the world, and welcome back to our weekly improvised political sciences lecture. And if you've been greeted by an ad at the start of the stream, then this means that it is all fine and dandy and the system is working as intended. Now then, let me set up the window so that it is working as intended, which is right here. There we go. Once again, we'll be going back to the Dictator's playbook, and after that, I'm thinking we also go back to Jason Schreier's Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. But that, of course, comes a little later. Now then, music going up in a second, and we can begin in 3, 2, 1. Let me know if it's a little too quiet. Maybe bump it up to this point. Should be fine. Anyway. At last, a new ruler has shaken up the coalition that first brought him to power, and he has the right supporters in place. Money is coming in thanks to the taxes being levied. Now comes the real task of governing. Allocating money to keep the coalition happy, but not too happy, and providing just enough to keep the interchangeables from rising up in revolt. As we have seen in North Africa and the Middle East in the past few years, and as we saw in Eastern Europe in the 80s and 90s, this can be an awkward tightrope to traverse for any leader. The last few decades encourage us by showing that in time many autocrats fall off that tightrope. It is really hard to strike just the right balance between benefits for one's coalition and for the mass of interchangeables. Any new incumbent who wants to be around for a long time needs to fine-tune the art of spending money. Of course, he can err on the side of generosity to the coalition or to the people, but only with any money that is left for his own discretionary use after taking care of the coalition's needs. He had better not err on the side of shortchanging anyone who could mount a coup or revolution. Shortchange the wrong people and any leader's fate will confirm our abuse of William Wordsworth's famous line, "Getting and spending will lay waste our powers." Thus we turn to the essential question of all democracies: how to allocate resources aimed at providing policies of benefit to everyone in a society. These public goods come in a variety of different forms depending on the tastes of those in a position to demand such policies. Those in such a position, of course, are the incumbents' essential backers. Different groups of essentials will have different baskets of public goods, oriented policies in mind. Some will want to spend more on a social welfare safety net, others on education, still others on benefits for the elderly or for the young, benefits to the arts, and so forth. Although all of these are of interest and will be touched upon, however briefly, we are especially interested in core public benefits like education, healthcare, and such freedoms as a free press, free speech, and freedom of assembly. Although security against foreign invasion certainly is a central public good, we leave consideration of foreign threats to a later chapter and focus here on domestic policy choices. For now, let's have a look at how public goods can help society as a whole and how they help entrenched leaders. To balance between spending policies that benefit the masses and those that favor the essentials, leaders would do well to reflect on those parts of Thomas Hobbes' philosophy of government, which we touched on briefly in the introduction. He had a lot right, but Hobbes' ideas about government weren't infallible. Wait, what do you mean I'm looping? What do you mean I'm looping? The record is supposed to be the same as it ever was, if you mean the music. What? God fucking damn it. It was the intonation then. Fine, fine. Anyway, where was I? While he realized that anyone who enriched society would avoid a revolution such as the one he lived through in England, he failed to distinguish between what it takes to keep the people at bay and what it takes to keep essential backers from betraying their leader, whether that leader is Hobbes's Leviathan, Plato's philosopher king, Rousseau's general will, or Madison's faction-ridden representatives of the people. Hobbes was sure his Leviathan had to be a benign ruler. That, so Hobbes seems to have thought, was the way to prevent a revolution such as he experienced. Without a ruler who enriched his people, Hobbes feared that for many, life would be, in his well-coined phrase, solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Hobbes was only half right. It is true, as Hobbes has believed, that happy, well-cared-for people are unlikely to revolt. China's prolonged economic growth seems to have verified that belief, at least for now. Keep them fat and happy, and the masses are unlikely to rise up against you. It seems equally true, however, that sick, starving, ignorant people are also unlikely to revolt. All seems quiet among North Korea's masses, who deify their dear leader as the sole source of whatever meager life-sustaining resources they have. Who makes revolution? It is the great in-between, those who are neither immiserated nor coddled. The former are too weak and coward to revolt, the latter are content and have no reason to revolt. Truly, it is the great in-between who are a threat to the stability of a regime and its leaders. Therefore, a prudent leader balances resources between keeping the coalition content and the people just fit enough to produce the wealth needed to enrich the essentials and the incumbent. We should not be surprised that those countries whose governments rely on few essential backers, that is, those that are least democratic, are the very places where Hobbes' state of nature is most likely to be an apt description of life for the masses. They're also, as we saw earlier, the places where leaders have the best prospect of staying in control for years and years. Leaders who depend on a large coalition have to work hard to make sure that their citizens' lives are not solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short. That doesn't mean democratic rulers have to be civic-minded, nor would they need to harbor warm and cuddly feelings for their citizens. All they need is to ensure that there are ample public benefits to provide a high quality of life. They just need to follow the rules by which successful leaders rule, adapting them to the difficult circumstances that any democrat faces, being stuck with dependence on an unruly crowd of essentials to keep them in power. Just as Democrats have no need of being civic visionaries, dictators likewise aren't bound to make life miserable. It just happens more often than not to work out better for them to do so. There are exceptions, but those exceptions tend to reaffirm the importance of obeying the rules of politics. As we have noted, it is okay for a leader to spend her pot of discretionary money on trying to bring the good life to her citizenry. By definition, discretionary money is money that is not required to keep the coalition loyal. The coalition has already been paid off before any resources become discretionary. Singapore, for example, has managed through benevolent dictatorship to produce a high quality of material life for its citizens, albeit without many of the freedoms that others hold dear. Maybe Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's longtime benefactor, was the embodiment of Hobbes' Leviathan. But benevolent dictators like Singapore are hard to find. The most reliable means to a good life for solid, ordinary people remains the presence of institutional incentives in the form of dependence on a big coalition that compels power-seeking politicians to govern for the people. Democracy, especially with little or no organized bloc voting, aligns incentives such as that politicians can best serve their own self-interest, especially their interest in staying in office, by promoting the welfare of a large proportion of the people. That, we believe, is why most democracies are prosperous, stable, and secure places to live. Perhaps you doubt that the path to a good life is ensured by the presence of a big coalition. You wouldn't be alone. Many distinguished economists, even quite a few with a Nobel Prize under their belts, are convinced that the best way to promote democracy is by promoting prosperity. That is why whenever they see an economic crisis looming on the horizon, such as a government so indebted that it is on the verge of default and bankruptcy, they call for debt forgiveness, new loans, lots of foreign aid, and other economic fixes. They resist the cry of people like us who demand improved governance before any bailout money is offered up to rescue a troubled autocratic economy. They are convinced that wealth, and not politics, is the better route to escape Hobbes' state of nature. Simply reviewing the history of economic bailouts that we began in the previous chapter makes clear that the very forgiveness without political change so eagerly embraced for third world financial crises is rarely sought when the crisis arises in a society that relies on a large coalition. The politics of economic bailouts can be quite different in small and large coalition regimes. Bailouts come in many forms. Shifts in domestic taxing and spending, loans, whether from a bank at home or abroad, debt forgiveness, or foreign aid. Any bailout is accompanied by demands for economic reform, whether the money comes from the IMF, the German Central Bank, or the taxpayers. A big difference between large and small coalition bailout recipients is that the former almost always institute reforms and the latter only infrequently so. Just like debt forgiveness, a bailout in the face of economic stress for autocrats is a way to solve an impending political crisis. When their economy becomes too feeble to provide sufficient money to buy political loyalty, autocrats face being overthrown either by a rival or a revolution. This, in a nutshell, is the story of the politico-economic crises faced by places like Tunisia and Egypt in 2011. A bailout, whether generated from within or through outside loans or aid, can buy off opposition and thwart the threat to the leaders' hold on power. Therefore, during an economic crisis, autocrats shop around for bailout money from others to save themselves, in the name of relieving their country's financial woes. For large coalition leaders, bailouts are a curse, or at least a necessary evil. A poorly performing economy is likely to be understood by voters as a policy failure by the leadership, resulting in their being overthrown out by the voters at the first opportunity. That was very much a part of the story of the defeat of the Republican Party in 2008, and when the economy did not turn around fast enough to satisfy voters, the defeat of the Democrats in the House of Representatives in 2010. So the need for an economic bailout strongly signals the voters to find new leaders with new policy ideas. Foreign aid rarely comes to the rescue of Democrats, for reasons we explain later. Therefore, financial crises are the need for a bailout are just about always bad news for Democrats. The rich countries of the world faced a severe economic crisis in 2008 and 2009. Both the Bush and Obama administrations sought to stem the worst of the crisis by providing massive financial bailouts to save the banking industries and other large businesses, restore liquidity in the market, and bring the US economy back into a path towards sustained growth. Much the same was done in Europe. These bailouts were accompanied by regulatory change. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, signed by President Obama in 2010, is a case in point. Faced with a severe recession, the Congress passed the largest regulatory reform since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. In contrast, in small coalition regimes, bailouts are all too often the means to preserve business as usual. Economic bailouts in autocracies rarely precipitate a serious review of economic or business policies. They're almost never accompanied by regulatory reform. Consequently, economic crises happen more often than in democracies, and so long as rich nations feel an urge to provide loans, debt forgiveness, or aid, rarely result in betterment for the society, although they do result in security for lousy leaders. Are dictators and economists right that economic solvency needs to come ahead of political change? Is becoming materially rich the precursor for the luxury of democracy? We think not. There are plenty of well-to-do places that nevertheless suffer under oppressive governments that keep ordinary people's lives as solitary, nasty, poor, brutish, and short as their neighbors in poorer nations. Take a look at just about any non-democratic oil-rich or diamond-studded regime. Yes, the world has produced wise, well-intentioned leaders even among those who depend on few essentials, but it neither produces a lot of them, nor does it ensure that they have good ideas about how to make life better for others. Indeed, a common refrain among small coalition rulers is that the very freedoms like free speech, free press, and especially freedom of assembly that promote welfare-improving government policies are luxuries to be doled out only after prosperity is achieved and not before. This seems to be the self-serving claim of leaders who keep their peoples poor and oppressed. The People's Republic of China is the poster boy for this view. When Deng Xiaoping introduced economic liberalization to China in the 1980s, experts in wealthy Western countries contended that now China's economy would grow and the growth would lead to rapid democratization. Today, more than 30 years into sustained rapid growth, we still await those anticipated political reforms. Growth does not guarantee political improvement, but neither does it preclude it. The Republic of China, aka Taiwan, and the Republic of Korea, aka South Korea, are models of building prosperity ahead of democracy. Needless to say, the People's Republic of China certainly is not fond of promoting either of those countries' experiences. Many economists arrive at the same inference as dictators, though from an entirely different perspective. For many economists, the contention that nations work on becoming rich before becoming free follows from how they think about politics. They treat politics just as so much friction, to be written off instead of dealt with. No doubt it is good to be rich, and many of the world's rich countries are democratic. But dependence on a large coalition of essentials is a powerful explanation of quality of life even when wealth is absent, just as it seems to be a harbinger of future wealth. Economic growth and success, in contrast, does not seem to be an assurance of improved governance and indeed may hinder it. This is a question worth exploring in greater depth, though for now our subject is how variations in the size of the group of essentials and interchangeables determines how resources are allocated between public and private rewards, so as to pay just the right amount to one's coalition while also paying just enough to keep the citizenry out from making trouble. From a leader's point of view, the most important function of the people is to pay taxes. All regimes need money. As a result, certain basic public goods must be made available even by the meanest autocrat, unless he has access to significant revenue from sources, like oil or foreign aid, that are not based on taxing workers. Public benefits like essential infrastructure, education, and healthcare need to be readily available to ensure that labor is productive enough to pay taxes to line the pockets of rulers and their essential supporters. These policies are not instituted for the betterment of the masses, even though of course some members of the masses, especially workers, benefit from them. Education as a means for getting ahead in life is a big deal for any country's citizenry. Indeed, a popular refrain among many liberal-minded thinkers is to extol the quality of education in otherwise oppressive states like Castro's Cuba or even Kim Jong-il's North Korea. And they have a good point. Both Cuba and North Korea have impressive primary education. For instance, a 1997 UNESCO study finds that Cuban 3rd and 4th graders far outperform their counterparts in other Latin American countries. As for North Korea, it has a 100% literacy rate. In contrast, only 81% of democratic India's people can read and write. But these facts can be misleading, or even downright wrong. That basic education is mandatory and extensive in such places often is used to argue that autocracy isn't so bad. Rarely do any of us stop to probe beneath these observations to find out why dictators pay to have well-educated 3rd graders, but do not carry that quality of education forward to higher learning. The logic behind political survival teaches us to be suspicious. We cannot help but believe that these public goods are not intended to uplift and assist the people unfortunate enough to live in such places. The rules of politics, as we know, instruct leaders to do no more for the people than is absolutely essential to prevent rebellion. Leaders who spend on public welfare at the expense of their essentials are courting disaster. These leaders, whether dictators or democrats, are all grappling with the same question. How much education is the right amount? For those who rely on few essential backers, the answer is straightforward. Educational opportunities should not be so extensive as to equip ordinary folks, the interchangeables, to question government authority. A naive person might look at any number of awful regimes and yet come to the conclusion that, because they provide such public benefits as nationalized healthcare or sound primary education, they're actually better to their people than many democratic states are to theirs. This is nonsense, of course. In the vast majority of cases, autocrats are simply keeping the peasants healthy enough to work and educated enough to do their jobs. Either way, literate or not, they're still peasants and they're going to stay that way. A far better measure of leaders' interest in education is the distribution of top universities. With the sole exception of China and Singapore, no non-democratic country has even the one university rated among the world's top 200. Despite its size, and not counting universities in Hong Kong, which were established under British rule before Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, the best-ranked Chinese university is only in 47th place, despite China's opportunity to draw top minds from its vast population. The highest-ranking Russian university, with Russia's long history of dictatorship, is 210th, possibly even lower by this point in time. By contrast, countries with relatively few people, but with dependence on many essential backers like Israel, Finland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Canada, have several universities ranked among the top 200. That this uneven distribution of top-notch universities favors large coalition locales is no accident. Highly educated people are a potential threat to autocrats, and so autocrats make sure to limit educational opportunity. See, you're getting it. Autocrats want workers to have basic labor skills like literacy, and they want their own children, their most likely successors, to be truly well educated, and so send them off to schools in places like Switzerland, where Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il's youngest son and designated successor, was educated. Dictators also like to have their children educated in leading universities in the United States, and especially in Oxford University in the United Kingdom. In fact, one might almost conclude that Oxford is a breeding ground for authoritarians. It certainly is the alma mater of many, including Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, the Bhutto family of Pakistan, kings of Jordan, Bhutan, Malaysia, and even little Tonga. England's big coalition system opens the door pretty broadly to give access to higher education. When the leadership relies on few essentials, higher education is for the children of the powerful. When the block of essentials is big, it is for the betterment of everyone. One of the features of the old Soviet regime that Boris Yeltsin balked at, for instance, was exactly the privileged access the children of Communist Party leaders had to the best universities regardless of their ability. Kids of loyal families were helped to get ahead. The capable children of potentially dissident families were kept down by being excluded from broad access to the best schools. One thing that both dictatorships and democracies have in common is the special advantage insiders seem to have when it comes to the top universities. Even places with lots of essentials seem to work that way, although the privileged access is granted by the universities and not imposed on them by the government. The President of the United States doesn't get to tell Harvard who to admit. A closer look at the system demonstrates the reasoning. Harvard and many other prestigious universities favor legacies, that is, the children of alumni, because such students are likely to bring the university more donations from its wealthy graduates. What may seem like a case of privileged access in an otherwise open, large coalition system actually reflects the internal dynamics of universities themselves. We shouldn't fail to notice that universities in their own right constitute small coalition political systems with a pretty big batch of interchangeables. No surprise then that they behave like autocracies, favoring the rich and connected at the expense of those who lack political clout. If you doubt it, have a look at one day at how many administrators university presidents like to hire compared to faculty. It seems you can never have too many supporting cast administrators whose jobs depend on keeping the person at the top happy. Faculty, on the other hand, don't depend on keeping their bosses happy. They depend on keeping their colleagues happy long enough to get tenure, and then they're pretty free to do whatever they want. Why do you think we can write this passage? There's a delicate balance to be struck, to be sure, and so successful university leaders are especially skilled at doling out private rewards to anyone who could be a threat. People who raise money for the university frequently get a percentage of what they bring in to incentivize them. Faculty who are cooperative and are likely to more readily be granted sabbaticals, get research funds, pick the classes, usually small, that they teach, and so forth. So we shouldn't be surprised by distortions in merit in universities. They really are small coalition regimes. We might hope for a rosier picture when it comes to secondary education in places that need few essentials. Why wouldn't all political leaders favor open access to secondary school where students learn higher levels of math, science, language, literature, history, and social thought? That's easy to answer. These are dangerous public goods that shouldn't be doled out carefully. It isn't just necessary to have lots of people around with skills that are not absolutely required to produce revenue for the autocrat's regime. Why, for instance, would any autocrat eager to stay in power want to open the secondary schools to people who are not likely to contribute the coalition's wealth and security? Math and science are great subjects for study in China. Sociology and political sciences are the subjects of democracies. The incentives to provide good healthcare are not so different from the incentives to provide basic education. Keeping the labor force humming is the primary concern for leaders of small coalition countries. Everything and everyone else is essential. There is no point in spending lots of money on the health of people who are not in the labor force and who won't be in the labor force for a long time. One of the more depressing ways in which this can be seen is in the relation between the performance of healthcare systems for infants and the size of a government's winning coalition. It seems that a lot of dictators and their essential backers don't love babies. This is true when we think of seeming monsters like Saddam Hussein or the oft-praised Fidel Castro for his efforts to foster high-quality healthcare in Cuba. Saddam Hussein built lavish palaces while his people suffered under the impact of economic sanctions. The UN provided baby formula intended to offset the impact of this hardship on little children. However, Hussein allowed his cronies to steal it. The formula found its way to markets throughout the Middle East, yielding profits for Hussein, even as shortages in Iraq resulted in a doubling of the infant mortality rate. There is no doubt that Hussein was a miserable human being. It may be that his record is no better or worse than any other heartless brute. Alternatively, it could be that dependence on a small group of cronies made him act as if he were a brute. Perhaps in a different place and circumstance, he might have gone around kissing babies to garner political support. Perhaps Chemical Ali was right that Saddam was too merciful. Indeed, it so happens that even in many autocracies with reportedly good healthcare systems, infant mortality is high. This may be because helping little children does not particularly help leaders survive in power. Not that they don't like a cute baby as much as the next guy, but they recognize that helping babies does not help them. Cuba has the lowest infant mortality rate in Latin America. It's a commendable accomplishment. However, the real question is whether we should attribute this to Fidel Castro's beneficence in building a quality healthcare system, or whether he just inherited a good healthcare system from his predecessor, Fulgencio Batista. Batista originally rose in prominence as a participant in Cuba's 1933 coup. Although a succession of other figures became president of Cuba, Batista, as Army Chief of Staff, remained a key figure behind the throne throughout his transitional period. He defeated former president under the coup regime Ramon Grau San Martin in the free democratic elections of 1940. Batista then served as Cuba's democratically elected president from 1940 until his term ended in 1944. It is noteworthy that during this period, Batista enjoyed the support of Cuba's Communist Party because of his strongly pro-labor and pro-labor union policies. Indeed, during this period as a democratic leader under the rules of Cuba's 1940 constitution, Batista proved to be an effective social reformer who also helped promote successful economic policies. In short, he governed just the way we would expect a large coalition leader to govern. And yes, I do remember reading about that one. After his term expired, Batista moved to the United States. His preferred successor for the presidency lost to Grau in 1944 Cuban presidential election. Although still in the United States in 1948, Batista was elected to the Cuban Senate. He returned home to serve and then ran again for the presidency in 1952, but was a distant third in the polls to Robert Agramonte, the frontrunner, and Carlos Hevia. Seeing that he had no chance to be elected and possessed of the backing of the United States government, pro-American Batista launched a coup before the election took place. Backed by the army, Batista now assumed the presidency as a small coalition dictator rather than as a democratically elected large coalition leader. Surely this is yet another example of power taking precedence over political principles. The Cuban economy depended largely on agriculture, especially growing sugarcane, a highly labor-intensive activity. As a result, both Batista's and Castro's regimes, bereft of natural resource wealth, had to rely on workers to generate revenue. Each did have the benefit of supplementing that revenue with a significant amount of foreign aid from the United States in Batista's case, and from the Soviet Union in Castro's. Nevertheless, to stay afloat, both needed to maintain a healthy and reasonably educated workforce. Therefore, both Batista's and Castro's Cuba needed good health care as well as good basic education. We should not expect vast differences in the public goods provided by Batista after he became a dictator and those provided by Castro. To be sure, their ideological songs were radically different, but they both depended on a small clique to keep them in power. In both cases, the military was essential and so were loyal bureaucrats. So putting aside the window dressing each used to justify their form of rule, stripping out the ideology, they were running similar regimes. The main difference in our terms was that Batista had a small coalition and a small selectorate once he overthrew the constitution. Castro ran a rigged election regime, so he, like Batista, had a small coalition, but unlike Batista, his nominal selectorate was pretty big. Of course, the real Cuban selectorate under Castro, the influentials, was probably no bigger than Batista's real selectorate. So we should anticipate that both of them were good at producing good health care and good primary education. And the facts bear out these expectations. Although a headline fact is that Castro's Cuba has Latin America's best infant mortality rate, the details reveal that the relative quality of infant care has declined. Cuba had Latin America's best infant mortality rate under Batista as well as under Castro. In general, small coalition regimes gradually run their economy into the ground through inefficiencies designed to benefit the leader and essentials in the short run, at the expense of longer-term productivity. How quickly welfare would erode depends in what part of what foreign aid comes in to offset the economic woes brought on by small coalition governance. We should see trends indicating declining quality of healthcare in Cuba under Castro compared to Batista, not necessarily because one was more civic-minded than the other, but because time inexorably diminishes the quality of life for ordinary people in most petty dictatorships. Cuba's absolute infant mortality rate has improved markedly since Batista's overthrow, but Cuba's relative quality of infant care has not kept pace with the rest of the world. Medical technology has improved healthcare substantially since the end of World War II, and especially since the 1960s, right after Castro's revolution succeeded in 1959. Cuba's improvements in infant mortality, though substantial, have lagged behind improvements in infant mortality in many other countries. In 1957, not long before Batista was overthrown by Castro's revolution, Cuba's infant mortality rate was 32 per 1,000 live births. This was the 13th best in the world at the time. To put this impressive record in perspective, Cuba was outperforming Austria, Belgium, France, Israel, Japan, Spain, Portugal, and West Germany. Today, all of these countries outrank Castro's Cuba in infant mortality rates. Yet, until the demise of the Soviet Union, Cuba's economic growth rate was one of the highest in Latin America, and its high abortion rate, which terminates difficult at-risk pregnancies, is 58.6 per 100, according to the Guttmacher Institute. Cuba's infant mortality story is one of the better ones among countries with long histories of petty dictatorships. Indeed, even wealth provides a poor way to inoculate little children from untimely deaths. But having a big coalition is the best vaccine. Like all medicine, it is not perfect, but makes a huge difference. The world's 36 governments have depended on the largest groups of essentials to have 31 fewer infant deaths per 1,000 births than the 34 governments that depend on the smallest groups of essentials. Comparing the same 80 countries, but now based on per capita income, the poorest have 15 more infant deaths per 1,000 births than the richest. Being rich does facilitate saving babies' lives, but not as much as being democratic. For autocrats, money spent on people, like infants and little children, who are years away from contributing to the economy is money wasted. Resources should instead be focused on those who help the rulers stay in power now, not those who might be valuable in the distant future. When you see pictures and images flowing out of populations in crisis, it's apparent that suffering at the extremes of the lifespan is hardly uncommon in autocracies. It's not that these terrible conditions can't be reversed, it's that the autocrat must choose not to reverse them as a simple matter of cost. Funds diverted in such a fashion are taken right out of her own pocket and the pockets of the coalition. Consider the availability of as basic and essential a public good as clean drinking water. In a world in which easily prevented waterborne diseases like cholera, dysentery, and diarrhea kill millions of the young and old non-workers, clean water would be a tremendous lifesaver. The problem is that these are lives that autocrats seem not to value. Sure enough, drinking water is cleaner and more widely available in democratic countries than in small coalition regimes, independent of the separate and significant impact of per capita income. Honduras, for instance, is a pretty poor country. Its per capita income is only $4,100. Yet 90% of the people in Honduras have access to clean drinking water. Per capita income in Equatorial Guinea is more than $37,000, which is 9 times higher than in Honduras. And yet only 44% of its people enjoy clean, potable water. This is true even though both places have the same burden of a tropical climate. Both were Spanish colonies, and both are predominantly Christian societies. The big difference: Honduras is considerably more democratic, with a larger group of essentials than Equatorial Guinea. Is this comparison out of the ordinary? Not at all. To be sure, higher income countries on average do enjoy even higher quality drinking water than poorer countries. Looking within approximately equal per capita income slices of the world, however, those regimes that depend on a big coalition on average make quality drinking water readily accessible to almost their entire population, and those who depend on a smaller coalition lag behind by 20% or more. The availability and technology of clean water does not favor democratic societies. Democratic regimes favor ensuring that drinking water is clean. As we've demonstrated, even a nasty dictator provides the people with basic education and essential health care so that they can work at making the autocrat rich. There is one more public goods program that is necessary to translate labor into his or her wealth. Everything the workers make has to get out to the market so that the leader can sell the product of the workers' labor for money. That means there is a need for roads to transport what's been made to markets where people have money. Nevertheless, there is still a balance when it comes to infrastructure. Since roads run in two directions, one must be careful not to build too many roads, or especially roads to the wrong places. Roads are very costly to build and it is easy to hide their true costs. This makes them a good source of graft, which in turn makes constructing them attractive. But having a country too well connected can lead to new regional power centers, political, economic, or otherwise, that undermine the autocrat. And if things ever heat up sufficiently to encourage rebellion, the very roads that autocrats build can come back to haunt them. Shoddy infrastructure is often an intentionally designed feature of many countries, not a misfortune suffered unwillingly. Zaire's, today's Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mobutu Sese Seko, once told Rwanda's president Juvenal Habyarimana, "I've been in power in Zaire for 30 years and I have never built one road." Why? As he explained to Habyarimana, "Now they are driving down your roads to get you." Indeed, when Mobutu came to power in 1965, Zaire had about 90,000 miles of roads. 32 years later, when he was finally deposed, only about 6,000 miles remained. Just enough to sell goods and not enough to make it easy to get to Mobutu. So, roads to market? Yes. Roads to get you out of the country? Yes. Other roads? No. Consider how straight or curvy the roads are from the center of capital cities to the city's largest airport. Of course, just how straight the road is depends on a number of factors. There is topography and how sprawling the capital city is, the technology when the road was built, and how wealthy the society is. And then there is the size of the winning coalition. Wealth is not randomly distributed. Places that depend on broad-based support to keep the government in power tend to be wealthy too. That might lead us to think that airport highways are especially straight in wealthy, read large coalition, societies, since it is rich governments that can most easily compensate people for tearing down their houses to make efficient roads from the city to the airport. And yet, that isn't the case. Topography, unlike wealth, isn't dictated by politics. A landscape splattered with wide waterways and high mountains is likely to make the road from the capital city to its airport pretty curvy, regardless of the type of governments that runs the society. To just plow straight ahead in such circumstances means building tunnels and long bridges. Those are expensive. Tearing through villages is expensive too, if the townspeople need to be properly compensated when the government invokes its right to eminent domain to knock down houses. And the people who need to be compensated in such circumstances may well happen to be both influential and essential. If the townsfolk whose houses are in the way of an airport road are not influential or essential, then it is cheaper to go straight ahead than to skirt village after village. If the choice of route were just about economics, one might think that straight roads from city to airport are especially prevalent in rich countries. But if politics trumps economics, then straight roads will more often be the province of petty dictatorships rather than representative and rich democracies. That the difference between driving to instance and the distance as the crow flies is related to politics, and especially to how many essentials a leader needs, it is rather interesting and perhaps surprising, but related they are. We calculated the ratio of driving distance to the distance as the crow flies from the major airports serving each national capital for 158 countries. A low ratio means a fairly straight road. High ratios, more curves. Only 2 of the 30 lowest ratios, places where the driving distance is almost equal to the distance as the crow flies, fall in democracies, taking the average coalition requirements for governance into account over the past 30 years, that is from 1981 to 2010. Portugal and Canada have the straightest roads to their respective capital and city airports among societies whose leaders rely on lots of essentials to hold power. Portugal has the world's 13th lowest ratio and Canada is 28th. Which countries have the 10 lowest ratios? Answer: Guinea, Cuba, Dominica, Colombia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Ecuador, Ethiopia, and Equatorial Guinea. This certainly is not a who's who of democracy. Only Ecuador and Colombia's governments among this motley crew are making real progress toward dependence on a large coalition. The average coalition size for these 10 by our estimation is 42 out of a possible score of 100. The world's average is 62, that is 50% higher. The lesson is that when an autocrat needs a road to the airport, a good route of escape, he can just confiscate people's property, making the road as straight and as quickly traveled as possible. As President Obama observed in his State of the Union address on January 25, 2011, when discussing the similar issue of building railroads, if the central government wants a railroad, they get a railroad, no matter how many homes are bulldozed. He was contrasting what autocrats can do with what he, as a democratic leader, cannot. Democrats find using eminent domain politically costly, and so are more likely to go around a village or house than to knock it down. In the event that a Democrat ignores property rights, it's likely that all the freedoms she must provide will culminate in people taken to the courts and the streets to redress any perceived wrong. A smart Democrat, of course, tries to avoid such troubles, using eminent domain only when it benefits many people, especially members of the Democrats' constituency, the influentials. It is incredible to see how easily leaders can take people's property in the People's Republic of China, and how hard it is to do the same in Hong Kong. When essentials are few, pretty much anything goes. Roads are not the only infrastructure construction that seems to emphasize their private benefits in autocracies and their public benefits in democracies. Autocrats and Democrats need electric grids. A recent study, for instance, shows that when governments expand reliance on a large coalition, they shift electricity pricing and availability away from policies that favor industry and toward policies that help consumers, that is, the masses instead of the wealthiest in society. And then there are the Mobutu Sese Sekos of the world, who have worked out how to use electric power to advance their political survival. Mobutu famously replaced local electricity generating capacity near Zaire's copper mines with a hydroelectric station that was more than 1,000 miles away. This empowered him to cut off electricity at the touch of a button, guaranteeing that he and not some local entrepreneur controlled the flow of copper wealth. It's worth noting that the power lines bypassed all the people along the way. That's the right sort of infrastructure project taken up by someone who wants to use public policy to secure his hold on power. Massive construction projects like the Aswan Dam in Egypt and China's Three Gorges Dam are very much like Mobutu's power grid. These sorts of projects are great for autocrats. Although they dislocate vast numbers of people, they also generate vast corruption opportunities, making them gems of private rewards as well as providers of basic public infrastructure. It is noteworthy that they also cost vastly more to build than comparable dams in the United States or other democratic countries, where such projects serve primarily to advance public, not private, welfare. All leaders need to provide some public goods in order that the people can work to pay taxes. This is just as true in other organizational settings. Corporate bosses cannot expect their employees to produce in isolation. Communications, training, and team-building skills promote productivity, although they also facilitate the coordination of protest against the boss. For this reason, not all corporate phones connect to everywhere. Even the heads of crime families provide public goods that help mobsters earn, of which perhaps the most important is reputation. Mobsters would find it much harder to demand protection money if people did not believe they were backed by muscle. Mafias also provide muscle and deterrence to protect their members. Killing a mafioso is not to be undertaken lightly. Mobs also provide lawyers. Each of these services is a valuable reward, but more importantly, they keep the mafia earning. As with autocrats, mob bosses provide those public goods that help mobsters produce the wealth that their bosses need to stay on top. In small coalition polities, public goods often serve the narrow interests of the leadership and only indirectly the interests of citizens. The situation is almost entirely different for those who rely on a big coalition. For such leaders to desire to stay in office dictates that they must satisfy the large coalition's desire for access to good education at all levels, to quality healthcare at all levels, and most importantly, to the means to make the wishes of the coalition easily known by the government at all levels. It is surely no coincidence that all but one, Singapore, of the 25 countries in the contemporary world with the highest per capita incomes are liberal democracies. That is, societies that enjoy rule of law with transparent and accountable government, a free press, and freedom of assembly. These are places that foster rather than suppress or obstruct political competition. They foster such competition not out of civic mindedness, but rather out of the necessity of assembling a large coalition of supporters. Some of the richest people in the world live in tiny countries with tiny populations, like Iceland and Luxembourg. Others live in countries with vast populations, the United States or Japan, while still others live in expansive territories with relatively modest populations like Canada or Australia. Some of the wealthiest people live in religiously homogeneous societies like Denmark or Italy, but others reside in religiously heterogeneous nations such as United Kingdom or United States. Many of the richest countries are in Europe, but others are in Asia, North America, or Oceania. Some were imperial powers like Britain and France, others were themselves colonies like Canada or New Zealand. What then is that these countries have in common? It is not their geographic locale, their culture, religion, history, or size. What they all have in common is that they are democracies and therefore dependent on a large coalition, albeit of different shapes and sizes. And being dependent on many essentials, all of these regimes share in common the provision of the cheap and yet hugely valuable public good called freedom. Although such crucial freedoms as free speech, free assembly, and the free press are cheap to provide, autocrats avoid them like the plague. Democratic leaders no doubt wish they could avoid these freedoms, since it is these public goods that make it easy for opponents to organize to overthrow them. But those who depend on a large coalition can't escape them because they cannot amass a winning coalition without guaranteeing large numbers of people the right to say, read, and write what they want, and come together to discuss and debate at will. And then Democrats must listen and deliver what it is their constituents want, or someone else will come to power and do so. But when incumbents rely on a small coalition of cronies, then coalition members are readily satisfied by being made rich through corruption and cronyism. They do not risk these riches by demanding that incumbents siphon money away from them and into effective public policies. Under these conditions, leaders can easily limit the provision of public goods in general and freedom in particular if they so choose. Hence, democracies escape Hobbes' state of nature, and autocracies generally don't. Indeed, we can just see how dramatic the difference is in escaping the state of nature by looking at what happens when nature exercises its freedom to wreak havoc. We have in mind the consequences of natural disasters like earthquakes, cyclones, tsunamis, and drought. These certainly are not political events, but their consequences are the product of how rulers best allocate revenue and how people's freedom to organize shape allocation decisions. An earthquake of magnitude 7 on the Richter scale is 10 times larger than one of magnitude 6, just as an 8 is 10 times larger than a 7 and 100 times bigger than a 6. The city of Bam in Iran suffered a terrible earthquake on December 26, 2003. Its magnitude was between 6.5 and 6.6. Of the city's approximately 97,000 residents, 26,271 were killed. Chile, with a similar per capita income to Iran, experienced a magnitude 7.9 earthquake on June 14, 2005. That is 25 times bigger than the Bam earthquake, and it struck in a more populous area. The Chilean earthquake hit the city of Iquique with a population of about 238,000. Remarkably, it killed only 11 people. Was this good luck or good policy at work? We're going to find out in a second when I put on the next playlist, which is going to be yeah, let's go for that one for now. Chile and Iran both regularly experience substantial seismic activity. As such, we should expect that their governments are attentive to the risks of earthquake and the devastation that can befall their people. But everything we have argued urges us to be cautious about such an optimistic view of governance. Just to look at the past 50 years of history, Iran has consistently been a small coalition regime. The Shah's government may well have depended on a somewhat smaller group of essentials than Iran's current theocracy, But the two regimes are in practice not so different. By our way of thinking, therefore, Iran is not a place expected to foster the kinds of political freedoms that make it easy for people to express what they want and for the government to make a serious effort to fulfill those wants. Chile's last half-century was a bit more complex. The country was a fairly democratic polity from 1960 until 1973 and was then plunged into a small coalition regime that lasted until the end of the 1980s. By 1989, it was well on its way back to dependence in a relatively large coalition to sustain the government. This means that we should expect a substantially more public goods-oriented approach to seismic activity in Chile than in Iran, at least during the 1960s and since 1990. Chile experienced an extraordinary 9.5 earthquake in 1960. It killed 1,655 Chileans, as well as 61 in faraway Hawaii following the tsunami that resulted, and left about 2 million people homeless. Chile's fairly democratic government, at the time, immediately set about developing a new rigorous seismic code for all new constitution to protect its citizens from such destruction in the future. Left largely unaltered during the long years of military dictatorship, the code was revisited in 1993 when the once again democratic Chile made upgrades to reflect improvements in technology. It seems that Chile's seismic code was not only rigorous but also well enforced, resulting in greatly enhanced public safety against the ominous threat of natural earthquake disaster. Unlike Chile, Iran enjoyed no such period of democratic rule during the last half-century. As a result, there was no impetus for the government to strengthen its policies for protecting the public from disaster. As reported by Iranian Studies Group at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology following the Bam earthquake, considering the high seismicity of Iran, a comprehensive hazard reduction program was launched in 1991, but the effectiveness of the measures have been limited by lack of adequate funding and institutional coordination. The principal causes of vulnerability in the region include inefficient public policies and lagging and misguided investments in infrastructure. Translation: the small coalition Iranian regimes of the Shah and the Ayatollahs have siphoned off funds for their private benefit instead of directing them toward improved public safety against the predictable threat of seismic disasters. They provide no means for the people to make clear their desires, and they take few actions to secure their citizens against the predictable danger of death and destruction from seismic shocks. The comparison of Iran and Chile is far from unusual. China, like Chile, suffered a 7.9 earthquake of its own. It struck in May 2008, bringing down many shoddily constructed schools and apartment buildings, killing nearly 70,000. Even accounting for variations in Chile's and China's populations and incomes, it is impossible to reconcile the difference between China's death toll and Chile's, except by reflecting on the incentives to people proper building standards in democratic Chile, incentives missing in autocratic China and Iran. And lest it is thought these are special cases, it is worth noting that democratic Honduras had a 7.1 earthquake in May 2009, with 6 deaths, and Italy a 6.3 in April 2009, with 207 deaths. Even Japan's horrendous death toll following its massive 8.9 magnitude earthquake and tsunami in March 2011 is surely lower than a comparable event's death toll would have been in a small coalition regime. Japan spent a fortune in quality construction to withstand earthquakes, but almost no one can afford to protect against a seismic event and tsunami of the magnitude Japan experienced. Big coalitions save lives because big coalition leaders know that if they don't protect their ordinary citizens, they'll be turned out of office in favor of someone who will. Earthquakes and tsunamis are hard to foresee, but their aftermath is not. When there are lots of essential supporters, rescue is swift and repair is quick and effective. If it isn't as swift and effective as people expect, and in large coalition systems they expect it to be remarkably swift and effective, then political heads roll. This is what happened, as we will see later, following Hurricane Katrina in the United States. We will also see that when there are few essentials, poor relief does not lead to heads rolling. Rather, autocrats actually prefer to exaggerate damage to attract more relief funds. Once aid is secured, it is redirected into the private accounts of political elites rather than being steered toward rebuilding. Consider the relief effort in Sri Lanka following the tsunami of 2004. Such differences can be observed within nations too. Edward Luce toured refugee camps in Tamil Nadu on the east coast of southern India in the wake of the 2004 tsunami. Although 15,000 to 20,000 people were killed and there was widespread devastation, Within a year, virtually everyone had been resettled and the government had provided compensation for the losses of life and property. The people, although relatively poor, were highly informed about the process. The reason? Elections in Tamil Nadu are highly competitive, as the patronage style of block voting that is still prevalent in northern India has broken down. When Lucha toured the more northerly state of Orissa in 2006, he found people still housed in tent villages. But these were not victims of the 2009 tsunami. They were still coping with the ramifications of a cyclone that happened in 1999. Each of these examples of natural disasters tells a variation upon the same story. When governments depend on many essentials, they need to allocate the government's resources and provide valuable public goods like reliable building codes, relief efforts to rescue the victims of disaster, and when possible protective barriers like levees and dikes to forestall disaster. To know what the people need, governments need to make it easy for the public to make several clear what basket of public goodies they desire. That is best done by allowing the least costly and most precious public good of all: freedom. Public goods can be for the public's good, yet they can also be a means of exploiting the public. In large coalition environments, public goods overwhelmingly enhance public well-being. In small coalition settings, this is not true. Democracies are not lucky. They do not attract civic-minded leaders by chance. Rather, they attract survival-oriented leaders who understand that, given their dependence on many essentials, they can only come to and stay in power if they figure out the right basket of public goods to provide. Small coalition leaders figure out their solution to the exact same survival problem. It is just that when the coalition on which they rely is small, then the mix of public goods is slimmer and trimmer. It is designed for survival purposes in both cases. We don't need to appeal to civic spirit to explain why people have so much better a life in a democracy than in an autocracy. Higher levels of education are accessible to everyone when the coalition is large. Education is basic when the coalition is small. Healthcare is for those who are productive when the coalition is small. Babies and the elderly are not excluded from healthcare when the coalition is large. Good water is for everyone when the coalition is large. Otherwise, it is only for the privileged. And most importantly, freedom to say what you want and to dissent when you don't get it is abundant when the coalition is large, and is scarce in the extreme when the coalition is small. After this exploration of the benefits of living in a large coalition system, in the next chapter we will see the dark side of democracy, for large coalition regimes are not immune from providing private benefits to a select set of their citizenry. We will also see that corruption is a boon to small coalition leaders, and that in fact corruption, bribery, and other private benefits to their cronies help small coalition leaders stay in power. These same benefits could cost large coalition leaders their jobs. That is why the world's most corrupt regimes are always led by a small coalition. That's enough. That's enough memery. Because this particular portion of the stream is over, I am going to go grab myself a drink because my throat is parched, and then we will move on to the next portion of the stream, which is going to be game development stories from Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. I am going to leave you for a second. Be right back. I think I would start paying you in peanuts whenever I get enough of a funding from this whole endeavor, but that is a story for the future. Now, as for the book itself, we've already covered Halo Wars, so next you get a choice between an indie and a big publisher. Which one are you going to choose? I'll give you a couple of minutes to decide, or at least a minute. Maybe roasted. I like those they have in Bulgaria, which are dipped in salted nuts. Yeah, salted nuts would be fine just about now. Want an indie, huh? I see. In that case, we'll take a little bit of a step back and we go to Stardew Valley, and this will call for a change in soundtrack. Yeah, and some beer. That'd be nice. Let me set the scene once again. Where was it? There we go. So, Stardew Valley. Amber Hageman was selling pretzels when she had first met Eric Barone. She was about to finish high school, he had just started college, and they both worked at the Auburn Supermall, just south of Seattle. Barone was handsome, with dark eyes and a shy smile, and Hageman was drawn to his passion for making things, little games, musical albums, drawings. Soon, the two started dating. They discovered that they both loved Harvest Moon, a series of serene Japanese games that put players in charge of restoring and maintaining their own farms. During dates, Hageman and Barone would sit side by side and play Harvest Moon. Back to Nature on PlayStation, passing the controller back and forth as they befriended villagers and planted cabbages for profit. By 2011, the couple had grown serious and started living together at Barone's parents' house. Barone, who had just earned a degree in computer science from the University of Washington, Tacoma, was struggling to find an entry-level programming job. "I was just kind of nervous and awkward," Barone said. "I didn't do well at the interviews." As he scuffled around the house applying for any job he could find, Barone started thinking, why not make a video game? It'd be a good way to improve his programming skills, build some confidence, and maybe help him land a decent job. He'd tinkered with a few big projects before, like a web-based clone of the action game Bomberman, but he hadn't completed any of them. This time, he told himself, he would finish whatever he started. He told Hageman he'd be done in 6 months or so, just in time for a new wave of job openings. Now, peanuts dipped in paprika sounds very delicious. Barone's vision was well-defined, if unglamorous. He wanted to make his own version of Harvest Moon. The original series had grown less popular thanks to a trademark dispute and a sharp decline in quality, and it was tough to find a modern game that evoked the tranquility of the original farm simulators. The publisher Natsume had owned and distributed the Harvest Moon game since the franchise first started, but in 2014 the series' longtime developer, Marvelous, decided to split off from Natsume and publish its own games. Natsume still owned the Harvest Moon name, so Marvelous released its farming games under the title Story of Seasons. Meanwhile, Natsume developed its own line of new Harvest Moon games. Yes, it's all very confusing. Not to me. After all, stories like these are common in game dev. I just wanted to play another game that was exactly like the first 2 Harvest Moons, but just with different people and a different map, he said. I could have played that forever, different iterations of that same thing. But it didn't exist. So I just figured, why hasn't anyone made this? I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who want to play this kind of game. He also wanted to do it solo. Most video games are built by teams of dozens of people, each of whom specializes in fields like art, programming, design, or music. Some games, like Uncharted 4, employ staffs in the hundreds and use work from outsourced artists across the world. Even small independent developers usually rely on contractors and third-party game engines. Eric Barone, a self-proclaimed introvert, had a different plan. He wanted to write every line of dialogue, draw every piece of art, and compose every song on the soundtrack by himself. He even planned to program the game from scratch, eschewing established engines because he wanted to see if he could. Without collaborators, he wouldn't have to talk through ideas or wait for approval to get things done. He could make decisions based on what he, and only he, thought was best. Barone planned to put his little Harvest Moon clone on the Xbox Live Indie Games Marketplace, a popular storefront for independent developers. Unlike other digital distributors in 2011, XBLIG had few restrictions and would feature games from any developer, even a college graduate with no experience. My idea at the time was it would take a few months, maybe 5, 6 months, and then I would put it on XBLIG and sell it for a couple bucks, and maybe make $1,000 off of it or something, Barone said. And it would be a good experience, and then I would move on. Using a rudimentary set of tools called Microsoft XNA, Barone started writing basic code that would let his characters move around on two-dimensional screens. Then he ripped some sprites from Super Nintendo games and taught himself how to animate them, manually drawing different frames to create the illusion that the images were moving. In video game parlance, a sprite is a two-dimensional image representing a character or object on the screen. There was no methodology at all, Barone said. It was just completely haphazard and scrappy and random. By the end of 2011, Barone had given up on finding a day job. He'd become obsessed with his new project, which he called Sprout Valley, later retitled Stardew Valley, and he wanted to finish it before joining the grind of full-time employment. The premise of Stardew Valley was simple. You'd create a character and customize his or her appearance, from hair to pants color. At the beginning of the game, your hero would quit his menial office job at a giant corporation to go live in an idyllic village called Pelican Town, where he'd inherited an old disheveled farm from his grandfather. As this hero, you'd be tasked with growing crops, cultivating relationships with the villagers, and restoring Pelican Town to its former glory. Barone wanted to make it feel satisfying to do mundane chores like planting seeds and clearing debris in Stardew Valley, just as it was in Harvest Moon. You'd even be able to team up in online multiplayer with your friends. Barone's daily habits rarely changed. Every morning he'd wake up, make coffee, and stumble over to his computer, where he'd spend anywhere between 8 and 15 hours plugging away at the game. When Hageman got home, they'd eat dinner and go for a walk, where they would talk about Stardew Valley and mull over important questions like which characters should you be able to marry, and which characters should you be able to kiss. Living rent-free helped Barone get away with this pattern for a few months, but soon the couple wanted to move out on their own. They'd saved some money while living at Barone's parents' house, which helped, but it couldn't pay for everything, especially if they wanted to live in downtown Seattle. Barone's video game project brought in a whopping $0 a month, so Hageman, who was finishing up her undergraduate degree, had to support them both. Once they found a place, she started juggling 2 jobs, working as a coffee shop barista on the weekends and a caretaker after school. "We just kind of lived a humble life and it worked for us," Hageman said. As the months went by, they settled into this routine. Barone worked on his video game, Hageman paid for food, expenses, and rent on their tiny studio apartment. A less patient girlfriend might not have tolerated this arrangement, but Hageman didn't seem to mind it. When we were living at home, it wasn't as hard, and when we moved out to Seattle, the reality of having to support him became more real, but it really wasn't a problem ever, she said. He was working so much that it was impossible to be frustrated. It was true. Barone was working a lot, but he wasn't working very efficiently. Because he was making Stardew Valley by himself, there was nobody to hold him accountable for or force him to stick to a schedule. He had no employees or expenses, no producers were hovering behind his computer chair telling him to stop overscoping and just ship the damn game. Anytime Barone thought of a cool feature or an interesting character for players to befriend, he'd add it. Every week the game grew exponentially bigger. Of course, it's not very hard to distinguish between a game made by hundreds of people and a game made by one. The more realistic a video game looks, the higher the graphic fidelity, the more polygons in each 3D model, the more likely it's the product of a humongous, expertly trained staff that can handle highly technical aspects of art and engineering. Games like Uncharted 4 demanded massive teams, and tens of millions of dollars because they needed to make people's eyes pop. The book is mentioned in Uncharted 4 a lot by now because that's the previous chapter. For Barone, sitting alone in his studio apartment, game development meant something else entirely. His game didn't have high-end 3D graphics or a fully orchestral soundtrack. Stardew Valley used hand-drawn two-dimensional sprites and music that Barone composed himself with an inexpensive audio production program called Reason. Although Barone had little experience making games, he did know how to write music from years of playing in bands. In high school, he'd wanted to be a professional musician. He'd learned how to program in college, and he was gradually teaching himself how to draw the simplistic backgrounds and sprites that would make up Stardew Valley. By reading pixel art theory and watching guides on YouTube, Barone figured out how to compose each sprite by drawing individual pixels. He knew nothing about complicated video game lighting techniques, but he learned how to fake them, drawing semi-transparent white circles that he'd place behind torches and candles to evoke the illusion that they were brightening rooms. Where he really could have used help was scheduling. Some game developers set their project milestones based on what they think will take them the longest to make, while others build schedules around the demos they'll have to create for the public events like E3. May it rest in peace. Eric Barone had a different approach. He made whatever he felt like making. One morning he might have been in the mood to compose the theme song, and then in the afternoon maybe he'd draw character portraits or obsess over fishy mechanics. On any given day, Barone might look up at his 2D sprites, which by now had graduated from SNES ripoffs to original pixel art, and decide they were all terrible and that he had to start over. Hageman and other family members started regularly asking Barone when Stardew Valley would be done. In a month or two, he'd say. 2 months later, they'd ask again. Just another 3 months, he'd say. As time went on, Barone kept extending the window. 3 more months. 6 more months. Part of making a game by yourself when you have no money and you have a girlfriend who wants to have a life together is that you just have to get people to accept that you are going to do this and not try to dissuade you from it, said Barone. I had to convince everyone that they should believe in me. Part of that is, if I had just from the beginning said, oh, it's going to take 5 years, I don't think anyone would have accepted that. I wasn't even really conscious of this because it sounds really manipulative, but thinking back, I feel like maybe subconsciously I knew that I had to give it to them in little bits at a time. Oh, it'll take 6 months. It'll take a year. Okay, 2 years. In mid-2012, after nearly a year of working daily on Stardew Valley, Barone launched a website and started posting about the game on Harvest Moon fan forums, where there were plenty of people sharing his belief that the series has gone downhill. Those same people were instantly drawn to Stardew Valley. The game looked lively and colorful, like an undiscovered Super Nintendo game that someone had dug up after 2 decades and covered with a fresh coat of paint. The sprites were primitive, sure, but it was hard not to be charmed when you saw Stardew Valley's jolly farmer pull a little white turnip out of the ground. Fueled by the positive feedback, Barone started thinking about how he would get Stardew Valley into people's hands. He'd already ditched the Xbox in favor of the PC, which had a significantly bigger audience, but was now dominated by a single storefront, Steam, a massive network operated by the game publisher Valve. Indie game developers couldn't just slap their games on Steam and call it a day, though. They needed to get Valve's explicit approval. This was a problem. Barone didn't know anyone at Valve. He didn't have any publishing contracts. He didn't even know anyone else who made video games. Worried that nobody would even be able to discover the game he'd spent a year making, Barone searched the internet and stumbled upon a new program that seemed promising: Steam Greenlight. With Greenlight, Valve crowdsourced its approval process, allowing fans to vote on the games they'd want to play. Games that hit a certain number of votes, a number that the famously secretive Valve kept quiet, would automatically get a spot in the store. In September 2012, Barone put Stardew Valley on Steam Greenlight. I thought that the game was basically done, Barone said. I thought, yeah, I could have a game ready within 6 months. Shortly afterward, a British developer named Finn Bryce approached Barone with a proposition. Bryce, who ran a company called Chucklefish, was curious to see what Stardew Valley was all about. Anyone could see the potential early on, Bryce said. A PC platform Harvest Moon that was looking really good was immediately appealing. Barone emailed Bryce a build of the game, and soon enough the whole Chucklefish office was gathering around Bryce's desk to watch him play it. Parts of Stardew Valley were unfinished and it would crash occasionally, but it charmed them all. Finn Bryce made Barone an offer. In exchange for 10% of profits, Chucklefish would serve as a de facto publisher for Stardew Valley. Chucklefish didn't have the scale and reach of big publishers like Electronic Arts and Activision, may they burn in hell for eternity, but it did have lawyers, PR people, and other staff who could help Barone with the more tedious aspects of game development. You don't really know boredom until you've tried to read through a stack of trademark documents. Barone loved the thought of being associated with Chucklefish's space adventure game Starbound, which had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in pre-orders. He also learned that a bigger publisher would demand a much larger slice of the Stardew Valley revenue pie, closer probably to 50 or 60%, which made 10% seem like a solid deal. So of course I decided to take that opportunity, Barone said. On May 17th, 2013, Stardew Valley earned a vote to win approval on Steam Greenlight. Thrilled, Barone went out to his website to send out an update to his ever-growing base of fans. "I will do my scientific best to get this game into your hands as soon as possible," he wrote, "without skimping and making it as fun and feature-rich as I can within a reasonable time frame. I still can't give an exact release date, it is very hard to predict, and I don't want to make an empty promise. However, you can be certain that I am working hard every day and making continual progress." A few more months. Just a few more months. As development continued, Barone kept releasing that mantra, even though his mind was wandering into dark places. He had started waking up in the morning with an annoying feeling that his game wasn't good enough. "I realized that it was crap," Barone said, "and I needed to do something better, like this wasn't going to be a big hit or anything." He started hacking Stardew Valley apart like an overzealous woodcarver, throwing out the features and code he'd spent months writing. "I thought at some point that I was almost done with the game," Barone said. "But then my mind changed and I thought, okay, this isn't ready. I'm not happy with this, I don't want to put my name on it." In the following months, Barone remade all the sprites. He redrew the characters' portraits, he scrapped the core features like the procedurally generated section of the game's underground mine, and he rewrote large pieces of code to make Stardew Valley run more smoothly. After nearly 2 years spent working on the game, Barone felt like he had improved all his game development skills. He was now a better pixel artist than he had been when he started. He was a better programmer. He was better at visual effects, and he was better at designing audio. Why not take the time to improve all of those parts of the game? "He redid all the portraits probably 15 times or some crazy amount like that," said Amber Hageman. "Of course, now in retrospect I can see that his art was improving a lot and it was totally worth it, but at the time he would be sitting and fiddling and changing one person for days and days and days, and I was like, come on, it looks great, you don't have to worry about it." He's kind of a perfectionist, and if he didn't get the right feeling about it, he would want to keep doing it. Money was becoming tighter for the couple. They had eaten into most of their savings, and Hageman was still only working part-time as she prepared to graduate from college. To help with the bills, Barone considered putting Stardew Valley on Early Access, a service that let Steam users pay for unfinished versions of games before their final release dates, but he got anxious at the thought of taking other people's money before his game was done. It'd be too much pressure. Instead, he found a part-time job as an usher for the Paramount Theater in downtown Seattle, working there a few extra hours every week so they wouldn't go broke. Once a month, Barone would post an update on the Stardew Valley website outlining new features, fruit trees, cows, fertilizer, and putting it on an optimistic face for fans. By the end of 2013, Barone had hundreds of followers watching and leaving friendly comments on each of his blog posts. Yet his morale had tanked. For 2 years, Barone had been in front of a computer every day by himself, developing and playtesting the same game over and over again. Seeds of anxiety had been germinating inside him, and they would sprout at the worst possible times. "There were points when I was depressed and just thinking, what am I doing?" Barone said. "I have a degree in computer science and I'm working a minimum wage job as an usher at the theater. People would ask me, do you do anything else? And I said, I'm making a video game. I just felt embarrassed about it. They must have thought, oh, this guy's a loser." Some days Barone didn't work at all. He'd get up, put on some coffee, kiss his girlfriend goodbye, and then binge on 8-hour sessions of Civilization or old Final Fantasy games. When Hageman got home, Barone would click back to Stardew Valley so she wouldn't know he was goofing off. "I went through periods of extreme unproductivity," Barone said. "I would just be alt-tabbing and browsing Reddit and just not working." Maybe it was Barone's body trying to get him to take it easy. He hadn't taken off a weekend in 2 years. There were certainly points where he was super frustrated and hated the game, said Hageman, but he never got to the point where he actually stopped working on it. He would hate the game for a day and work on it to try to make it better, and then the next week he'd be ecstatic about the game. That was just kind of his style. Really, Barone needed a proper break. At the beginning of 2014, he saw Hageman playing with her brand new tablet and got an idea. He'd put Stardew Valley on pause for a while and make a mobile game, something small and easy that he could finish within a few weeks. For the next month, Barone ignored Stardew Valley and started hacking together an Android game about a surfboarding purple pair. Players would have to use the touchscreen to guide the pair through obstacles and compete for the highest score. On March 6, 2014, Barone released Air Pair to little fanfare. It made me realize that I don't want to be a mobile developer, Barone said. I actually hate it. Even if making the next Candy Crush wasn't Barone's ultimate destiny, the hiatus helped him zoom out a little bit. All those 7-day work weeks had been smothering him. He started taking more breaks from Stardew Valley, writing on his website, where fans had speculated that because he hadn't updated in 2 months he might be dead, that he was spending fewer marathon sessions on the project, not only to enjoy life, but also to make my time developing Stardew more productive, so that when I do sit down to work I am more focused. After she graduated from college, Amber Hageman started working full-time as a lab technician, which helped with their cash problems. Later in 2015, she would start attending graduate school, where she would receive a regular stipend for her studies in plant biology. Hageman didn't mind being the only breadwinner, but as she came home every day and saw how good Stardew Valley looked, she started pushing Barone to let go. I would be frustrated, Hageman said. Well, you're sick of it, why don't you just release it? By the end of the year, Barone's fans were asking for the same thing. Where was Stardew Valley? Why couldn't they play it yet? Writing on his blog post in April 2015, Barone yet again addressed the question. As soon as I know when the game is to be released, I'll announce it, he wrote. I don't have any intention of being deceptive or secretive. He added that he didn't want to write down a date just to have to delay it, and he didn't want to build more hype for Stardew Valley until the game was ready. When I first met Eric Barone in September 2016, we'd just seen the launch of one of the most hyped indie games in history, No Man's Sky. Slurping down pho noodles at a shop near his house, we had a long conversation about how that game had failed to deliver on its developers' promises. You can make a bunch of money by creating hype based off just saying stuff, and it works, Barone said. But it's not just my style. I don't even like hype at all. I don't want any hype. I would much rather create a great game, and I really truly believe that if you create the right game, and it's a really good game, it'll hype itself. It'll market itself. Well, joke's on you, Eric, because, as we all know, the ungoodening of No Man's Sky happened, and we have nobody to blame but Sean Murray. But I digress. I've been working on Stardew for years, and I want it to be released as much as anyone, Barone wrote. However, I am not willing to do that until the game is not only complete, but also in a state I am happy with. It simply could not be released in its current form. It's not a finished game yet. It's tantalizingly close to being a finished game, but it's also a huge project, and I'm just one guy. Being a solo developer came with 2 major challenges. The first was that everything took a very long time. Because he didn't have a strict schedule, Barone had a tendency to build 90% of a feature, get bored, and move on to something else. Although he had been working on Stardew Valley for nearly 4 years, he still hadn't finished many of the game's core mechanics, like childbirth and marriage. And it sure was hard to get excited about coding an options menu. I think that gave me a false impression that it was closed, because when you just boot up the game and play it from the first day, it seems like you can do everything, Barone said. But then if you actually look into it, everything needs a little more work. It would take months to revisit these incomplete features and finish them all. The second major challenge was loneliness. For 4 years now, Barone had sat by himself at a computer, rarely talking to anyone but Amber Hageman. He had no co-workers with whom to bounce around ideas, nobody to meet for lunch and a kvetch session about the latest game industry trends. In exchange for complete creative control, he had to embrace solitude. I think to be a solo developer, you have to be someone who's okay with being by yourself a lot, Barone said. And I'm that kind of person. I'm okay with it. But it's lonely, I have to admit. That's part of why I got the usher jobs, just so I could go out and interact with some other people sometimes. Staring at the mountains and trees of Stardew Valley, Barone found himself again unable to tell whether his game was any good. It resembled Harvest Moon, sure. You could harvest crops and go on dates and hang out with cute people at the annual Egg Festival, but Barone had worked on the game for so long now, he found it impossible to judge the squishier parts. Was the writing good? The music? Were the portraits pretty enough, or should he redo them yet again? That's another issue with being a solo developer, Barone said. You lose all objectivity about your game. I had no idea when the game was fun. In fact, I thought the game was garbage even up until a few days before release. I was like, this game sucks. Others disagreed. In September 2015, a group of Chucklefish staffers went on Twitch and streamed themselves playing an hour of Stardew Valley. The game still wasn't finished, but it was close enough. They could show off the basics, guiding along their main character as she cleared debris of her farm and met the friendly president of Pelican Town. Fans thought it looked great. Looks and sounds awesome, wrote one commenter. You really are a one-man army. It was becoming increasingly clear the closer we got that this was going to be a big deal, said Finn Bryce. Even with our faith in the project, it far surpassed what we were hoping for. And what we were hoping for was already several orders of magnitude higher than what Eric expected. At the beginning of 2015, Barone had decided he wasn't going to add anything new to Stardew Valley. Instead, he said he'd spend the rest of the year fixing bugs and tweaking small things to make the game feel more fun. It didn't take him very long to violate that rule. By November, he'd added crops, crafting recipes, private bedrooms that you could visit if you befriended their owners, a quest log, a traveling merchant, and a horse that you won't need to feed or care for so as to keep things stress-free, Barone told fans. Despite those late additions, the game was almost done, except for one key part. Barone had originally promised that Stardew Valley would come with both single and multiplayer modes, but hooking up the multiplayer was taking far longer than he'd anticipated. As 2015 dwindled and winter started approaching in Seattle, where he and Hageman had ditched a cramped studio in favor of a modest house that they now shared with two other friends, it became clear that releasing the complete version of Stardew Valley might take another year. Barone spent weeks trying to make a decision. It would feel crummy to release an incomplete game. But fans had been asking him for years when Stardew Valley would come out. Wasn't it time? Without multiplayer, the game might not sell as well. But he'd been working non-stop for 4 years. Like Stardew Valley's silent protagonist, Barone had grown tired of the daily grind. I was so sick of working on Stardew Valley that I just had to release it, Barone said. I just reached the point where all of a sudden I thought, okay, it's pretty much ready. I'm super sick of working on it. I don't want to work on it anymore. On January 29, 2016, Barone announced the news. Stardew Valley would be out on February 26th. It would cost $15. Barone had no idea how to launch a marketing campaign, but hey, that was why he'd agreed to give 10% of his profits to Chucklefish, whose PR people sent codes for Stardew Valley to journalists and Twitch streamers. Barone had been skeptical about streaming. I was afraid that people would see it on Twitch before launch, and then they'd feel like they'd already seen the game and they weren't going to buy it, he said. But early streams and videos generated more buzz for Stardew Valley than any press outlet. That month, it was one of the most popular games on Twitch, appearing in the streaming's website's front page nearly every day. During those final February weeks, Barone gave up all pretense of taking days off. He spent every waking hour sitting at his computer or standing, thanks to a makeshift standing desk he'd created by putting his monitor on top of an empty Wii U box, and fixing bugs. Other than his roommates and a couple of friends he'd asked to check out the game, he had no testers. There was no QA team. He had to catch, document, and fix every bug on his own. That was hellish, Barone said. I didn't sleep for days. Early in the morning, before his game was due to come out, while trying to fix a pesky last-minute localization error, Barone fell asleep standing at his desk. On February 26, 2016, a drained Eric Barone launched Stardew Valley. His girlfriend and housemates Jared and Rosie had taken off work for the occasion, as they sat upstairs with Barone while the game went live. As they all cheered and celebrated, Barone stared at his Steam developer account. When he clicked over to the live chart, he could watch the numbers move in real time as people bought and began to play Stardew Valley. As soon as he opened the chart, he'd know whether or not his game was an immediate success. At this point, Eric Barone had no idea what to expect. He'd felt burned out for a long time now, and even with his friends telling him the game was great, there was no predicting how the world would react to his little Harvest Moon clone. Would people buy it? Would they actually like it? What if nobody cared? He opened the chart. 6 months later, on a warm Thursday afternoon in Seattle, Eric Barone hopped down the front steps of his apartment, carrying a box full of video game plushies and wondering how much he could fit in his car. Friday was the start of Penny Arcade Expo, or PAX, a gathering of geeks from across the globe. Tens of thousands would be crowding the show floor, hunting for cool new games to play, and Barone had booked a small booth to demonstrate Stardew Valley. It was his first convention ever, which was causing him some anxiety. He'd never even met another game developer, and let alone potential fans of his work. What if they were awful? Alongside two of his housemates, and me visiting from New York, Barone started packing his trunk with essentials. 2 small computer monitors, a homemade banner, a bag full of water bottles, some cheap pins, and stuffed toys from Stardew Valley. When we finished packing, Barone opened the front passenger's door and climbed to the driver's seat. The door had been broken for months, he said. The car, a hand-me-down, had belonged to his family for nearly 20 years. I asked if he planned to get the door fixed. He said he hadn't really thought about it. It was a familiar, almost hackneyed scene. Independent game developer scores coveted spot at big conference, recruits housemates to help man the booth. If the developer is lucky, the weekend's press and exposure will lead to a few hundred new fans. For indies, that's a huge opportunity. Great word of mouth during shows like PAX can transform a small game into a huge success. But Eric Barone didn't need any help. On that Thursday in Seattle, as he climbed across the front passenger's seat, Stardew Valley had already sold 1.5 million copies. Since he'd launched the game, it had grabbed close to $21 million. Eric Barone, who was 28 years old and couldn't open the front door of his car, had over $12 million in his bank account. And he still drove around town in a broken Toyota Camry. People are asking me, "When are you buying that sports car?" Barone said. "I don't need it. I don't know when that's going to change, you know? At some point, I guess I'll probably buy a house, but I'm not in a rush. I don't really need luxuries. I know that doesn't make you happy." For the next few days, standing in a cramped booth on the 6th floor of the Washington State Convention Center, Barone shook hands and signed autographs for the first time in his life, feeling like a genuine rock star. Fans came dressed up as Stardew Valley characters like the purple-haired Abigail and the suave Gunther. Some people brought him art and homemade presents. Others shared personal stories about how playing Stardew Valley had gotten them through tough times. "I heard a lot of people thanking Eric in just these really sweet, heartfelt ways, and that was really nice for me to see," said Amber Hageman, who helped run things at the booth. That was basically what I wanted. I wanted Eric's work to be appreciated and for other people to experience his music, writing, and all these things that I'd always admired and thought he was really good at. Getting to hear other people appreciate that and let him know, that was really cool to see. The past year had been a blur for Eric Barone and Amber Hageman. After Stardew Valley launched, Barone watched it leap to the top of Steam's bestseller lists, selling tens of thousands of copies a day. He had thought the game might do well, but the final numbers were beyond expectations, which was simultaneously gratifying and terrifying for Barone. With success came pressure to keep making the game better. Now that more than 5 people had gotten their hands on the game, Barone had to spend all of his free time zapping the bugs that kept popping up. "It would be right as we were trying to go to sleep," said Hageman, and he'd be freaking out like, "Okay, I just have to stay up and fix this," and he'd be up the whole night. It became a vicious cycle. Friends would submit bug reports, and Barone would release patches to fix those bugs, only to inadvertently trigger more bugs. Then he'd pull all-nighters trying to fix the new ones. This pattern went on for weeks. "I think success like that was on your hands can be quite a shock," said Chucklefish's Finn Bryce. "Suddenly you feel as if you owe a lot of people a lot of things." What this success also meant, and what was still tough to internalize 6 months later, was that Eric Barone was now a multi-millionaire. You might not have guessed it from the modest house he shared with his girlfriend and housemates, or from the broken Toyota he drove around Seattle, but in half a year he had already made more money than most game developers see in their careers. Barone's previous life, working as an usher relying on Hageman for income, felt like it had existed in another dimension. Before the game came out, we had to budget for food and stuff, he said when I asked if he had done anything with his newfound riches. Now I'll get a bottle of wine if I wanted, or whatever. I don't worry about that. He paused to think for a few seconds. I also bought health insurance, which I didn't have before. Later, Barone would tell me that he bought a new computer. It was really just surreal. That's how it felt at first, said Amber Hageman. It's really abstract. Yeah, we have a lot of money suddenly, but it's all just numbers on a computer screen. We've talked about how eventually we'll be able to get a house, which is cool. And the Sunday newspaper that always comes with a really fancy house magazine in it, we flip through that just for fun, because that's actually somehow possible now. We're not actually going to do that. It's just fun to look at. In 2014, the New Yorker writer Simon Parkin published an article titled The Guilt of Video Game Millionaires, examining the complicated emotions triggered by indie developers' financial successes. In the article, game makers like Rami Ismail, the designer of Nuclear Throne, and Davey Wreden, the creator of The Stanley Parable, described the litany of feelings that came with newfound wealth. Depression, anxiety, guilt, creative paralysis, and so on. The money has made relationships complicated, Edmund Macmillan, the designer of the platformer Super Meat Boy, told Parkin. I'm just a guy who makes games. I'm an artist who likes to be alone. This success has artificially elevated me. It's called jealousy, even hatred. Eric Barone was caught in a similar emotional vortex. In the months after launching Stardew Valley, he felt overwhelmed with intense and sometimes paradoxical feelings. At first, as the numbers started climbing and he started getting calls from big companies like Sony and Valve, Barone started letting it get to his head. I thought I was some kind of hotshot, he said. Microsoft took him out to fancy dinners. Nintendo invited him to tour its swanky headquarters in Redmond, a place so secretive that to get in you had to sign an NDA, promising not to take any photos. Everyone wanted something from me, Barone said. Nintendo wants me to port the game to their consoles, and I think that what they really want is an exclusive deal. But I'm not doing that. Barone would later announce ports of Stardew Valley for the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. Yet insecurity kept creeping in. Barone felt like a tourist in a foreign country, trying to absorb decades worth of gaming knowledge as publishers wined and dined him. He had always liked video games, but until now he didn't know much about the culture surrounding them. I was thrown into this crazy world all of a sudden, he said. I went from being an absolute nobody to suddenly being thrust into this scene which I felt like a total outsider from. I'm just a guy who got lucky and happened to make the right game at the right time. Barone sunk deeper into his work, sacrificing sleep to keep cranking out patches for Stardew Valley. Then he started looking at his massive list of tasks, a list that he included not just for several patches full of new content, but the multiplayer mode he'd promised for years before the game launched. What bummed Barone out the most was that programming the multiplayer wouldn't offer any creative challenges. It was simply a matter of writing lines and lines of networking code, which he dreaded. One morning, halfway through 2016, Barone suddenly stopped working. He just couldn't do it anymore. After 4.5 years of non-stop work, he thought of dedicating months of his life to Stardew Valley's multiplayer mode was nauseating him. I just felt completely burned out, he said. I was doing so many interviews and talking on the phone with people every single day and doing business calls, merchandise. It just got to me at some point. He called up Chucklefish and said he needed a break, and the publisher offered to put on one of his own programmers on multiplayer, which Barone happily accepted. It's normal in game development for staff at big companies to take long sabbaticals after shipping their games. When the crunch is over and they've made it out of the hellfire, game developers are generally entitled to take a month or two off to recharge. Barone hadn't done that in February when the game had launched, but over the summer he decided that it was time for a long break. He spent hours playing PC games and zoning out in front of the computer. He drank a lot. He smoked a lot of pot. He had started taking an herb called ashwagandha, which helped relieve stress and keep him energized, but even that couldn't get him motivated to spend much more time on Stardew Valley. On August 6, 2016, Eric Barone wrote a new post on the Stardew Valley website. He wanted to update fans on the progress of his newest patch, 1.1, which was supposed to add new features and content to the game. To be entirely honest, he wrote, the main reason the update is taking so long is that I was feeling very burnt out for a while recently and my productivity went way down. Stardew Valley has consumed nearly every waking moment of my time for almost 5 years now, and I think my brain demanded some time away from it. Barone added that he'd spent the summer doing very little and feeling awfully guilty about it. In truth, I've always had ups and downs, periods of intense productivity and energy followed by periods of low motivation, he wrote. I've been this way for as long as I can remember, but this time around did seem a little worse than usual, but I reminded myself that with the success of Stardew Valley, my life got very weird very suddenly. It's probably normal to need some time to adjust. I'm not even sure if this recent funk was due to the sudden success, to my own volatile brain chemistry, or simply a result of working too hard for too long without a break. Sometimes I forget that I'm actually a human with a need to relax and have a little fun. There wasn't much more time for relaxation, though. After PAX, Chucklefish told Barone that to hit this deadline for the PS4 and Xbox One versions of Stardew Valley, he'd have to finish the 1.1 patch by the end of September. Barone again went into manic work mode, crunching for weeks to hit that deadline. Once he got there, burnout snuck up on him yet again, and the cycle continued. In November 2016, as he kept working intermittently on Stardew Valley, Barone got an email from a representative of the publisher NIS America, asking if he'd like to meet a man named Yasuhiro Wada. Of course, Barone said. It would be crazy to pass up that kind of opportunity. Wada, a Japanese designer who'd been making games since 1980s, was in Seattle promoting his new simulation game, Birthdays at the Beginning. Before that, however, Wada had been best known for designing and directing a game about running your own very farm. He'd called it Harvest Moon. Anxious and intimidated, Barone drove to the office space that NIS America had rented in downtown Seattle, knowing he was about to meet the man whose work had inspired him the most. I was quite nervous about meeting him, Barone said. But I figured I have to do this because it makes for a great story, if nothing else. Barone and Wada shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, speaking to one another through Wada's Japanese-English translator. Barone said he'd brought his Super Nintendo cartridge of the original Harvest Moon, which Wada signed with a smile. They had dinner, drank beers, and played each other's games. It was so surreal, Barone said, just to talk to this guy who made Harvest Moon. He was 30 when the original Harvest Moon came out, and I was just a little kid playing it. And now I'm meeting the guy and talking to him about his development on that game, and he knows Stardew Valley. Wada told Barone that he enjoyed playing Stardew Valley and that he was thrilled to see how Barone had iterated on the genre he'd pioneered all those years ago. He kind of got addicted to cleaning up his farm, said Barone. He'd spend most of the time just chopping the grass with a scythe and chopping down trees. 5 years earlier, Barone had been living with his parents, flunking job interviews and trying to figure out what to do with his life. Now the creator of Harvest Moon was chopping trees in his best-selling video game. Surreal might have been an understatement. In December 2016, nearly a year after Stardew Valley had launched, I called Barone to see how he was doing. We spoke about his meeting with Wada, about his manic work cycles, and about the glitches that he and Chucklefish had been running into with their console ports. He told me he was again sick of Stardew Valley and that he was ready for something new. I asked if he started planning his next game. Yes, Barone said. He was thinking about he might make a game about catching bugs. I asked how much he thought it might take. I'm trying to be a little realistic this time around, Barone said. I'm hoping it takes 2 years. What a story, Mark. What a story. May the tale of Eric Barone be an inspiration to you all. As for me, once again, my vocal cords are feeling the stress, so I think I am going to be retiring for the night. Hopefully, you've enjoyed listening to these stories as much as I enjoyed telling them to you. And on that note, I will most likely see you again tomorrow when we will be playing Halo Wars Definitive Edition together with Kix. It's time to test out the co-stream feature after all. See you later, and peace out.